Good afternoon. I want to welcome everyone to our special board meeting, March 23rd, 2022 at 12 p.m. Let's see, welcome and a call to order, Pam. Roll call.
Yes, sir. Mrs. Robles.
Aye.
Ms. Sanchez.
Here.
Dr. Graham.
Here.
Ms. Naheda.
Here.
Mr. Haggerty.
Here. And before we start, Pam, if anyone wants to join this meeting, you can go to https://www.youtube.com/user/go EPCC. Okay, any public comment, Pam?
No, sir.
Okay. Next thing, Mr. Smith, could you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I apologize, Mr. Smith. It should be Dr. Smith. Yeah. Okay.
Don't forget it, sir.
Okay. No comment? No public
No, sir.
comment? Okay, item 5. Go ahead, Pam.
Item 5.1, Ms. Josette Shaughnessy, Vice President of Financial and Administrative Operations, will update the Board of Trustees on the budget development process for fiscal year 2022-2023.
Good afternoon, Chair Haggerty, Dr. Serrata, members of the board, members of the cabinet, my colleagues, and the listening audience. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to give you a brief, hopefully brief, trying to be as brief as possible. This is a long process, but to give you some highlights of the budget development process for next fiscal year. Believe it or not, we're almost at 7 months of the fiscal year, and we're already working, especially Ms. Teyes, our budget director, and her staff, feverishly working on the budget for next year. So, that said, just to give you the agenda, so I'll just give you a brief an overview of the process for next year. Our revenue sources, what do they look like for this current year? Because that's going to be the basis for next budget. The overview of our current expenditure budget, the one that you adopted last August, our projected revenue for next fiscal year, and then we're going to be looking at scenarios for a potential tuition rate increase or tax increase or a combination of both, depending on what is needed to balance our budget for next year. And we'll review our budget strategies and see what we can work out. Please know that this is very preliminary. We're still working. Obviously, we just started the budget development process. The summer enrollment is ongoing. The fall enrollment registration is going to start on April the 1st. So we still don't know how we're going to fare for next fall. And obviously, that would be the basis for next fiscal year tuition revenue. And then we'll talk about our next steps. So this is a quick calendar here. We started virtual budget workshops for budget heads and support staff. And during those budget workshops, Ms. Teyes and her staff kindly gave some training on how to process budget requests to be submitted to the budget office for the purpose of developing our baseline budget, and some hands-on training about how to monitor your budget on a regular basis. February was also the time frame for executive level to submit or to complete their budget requests. During that time, those executive levels have a chance to review their current budget and reallocate resources wherever they can, and to fund some things that are needed for next fiscal year. March 11th, that's when the budget requests were due to the budget office. Currently, March-April timeframe, this is when the budget office compiles all the budget requests to generate the baseline budget that we usually present to you sometime May or June timeframe. Mid-April, we meet with our vice presidents to review their respective budget. We want to make sure that we're on the same page, that whatever they submitted is what they meant to submit, and we also obviously check the accuracy of the information. May, we review the preliminary baseline budget with Dr. Sedata to include revenue projections, and we start strategizing on how we're going to cover additional requests that are above the adopted budget or the rollover budget, or potentially also review any salary enhancement recommendation. Technically, June, July, that would be the review and approval of additional funding requests by Dr. Serrata. It is strictly based on availability of funding. June, July, this is when you are blessed with a bunch of budget workshops, and hopefully we can limit those to maybe 2 of them. And then in August, finally, we come before you for the adoption of the budget for the following fiscal year. Current fiscal year revenue is going to be the basis for the revenue projection for next fiscal year, and the preliminary budget is going to be based on the rollover budget. So in other words, we have an adopted budget, and what is different this year is in the adopted budget that you all approved last August, there was an item in there for HER funds, for the recovery of lost revenue that we actually included in our budget, and we set aside only for one-time funding. So technically, the rollover budget here, that doesn't mean that we're going to roll over $149 million. It could be a little bit less than that because we may not have as much in terms of revenue recovery. And I'll explain that in just a little while so we can put a number to what I am saying. Additional requests are going to be considered only for essential needs. Of course, you know, that's really the way we operate. We don't, executive levels normally don't request anything above what they truly need. There's no such a thing. There's a wish list, but there's also something that is truly essential. So increase in overhead costs, we don't have a choice. El Paso Electric raises our rates, then we don't have a choice but to obviously enhance that budget. Now, can we certainly practice some energy saving practice? Sure, we can do that. But in general, those costs have to be covered. We don't have a choice. Benefits, we have to cover those, and other critical services, especially the ones related to safety. Evaluate salary enhancement is always a priority during our budget development process. This is something that we feel is important to consider for our employees, and we want to remain competitive in hiring and retaining faculty and staff. So what has been our strategic planning for this next fiscal year? And you hear this every year, by the way. Every year is different. There's not one year that is exactly the same as the previous year when it comes down to strategic planning. So we know that next year we do not get additional state funding. So how do we then fund salary enhancement if we want to make a recommendation if we don't have additional state funding? So the revenue's got to come from somewhere else. We're also in the middle of a base year, which is going to determine our state reimbursement, our state funding at the next legislature, which is planned for January 2023. We continue to experience challenge with declining enrollment due to the pandemic. It seems like this is starting reversing itself. Our summer enrollment right now appears flat, which is good news, because it could appear as going down as compared to last year at the same time. So let me give you an example. Fall enrollment of fall of 21 was lower than what we had projected. Spring enrollment was lower than what we had projected. So the revenue projection that you're going to see in a little while reflect that. Summer, we did not know yet if we needed to bring that revenue, that tuition revenue down or not. The bottom line is right now it appears flat, so what you're going to see in a little while in terms of revenue hopefully will hold to be a starting point for next fiscal year. And if it is flat, hopefully that will mean that maybe there is an increase in enrollment and maybe will bode well for the fall semester. Summer enrollment usually is a good gauge for our fall enrollment, and so we hope that that will hold true this year. Now, this year also is as an even year, is the time when we evaluate a 2-year tuition increase cycle. And I'll talk about that in just a little while. First and foremost, this board has to adopt a sustainable budget. And the reason why I say a sustainable budget, why is it any different from previous year? I mean, every year we want to approve a sustainable budget, right? But the reason why I say that is since 2020, we have been receiving federal funds under the HERF programs. First it was CARES, and it was CARISA, and then eventually it was ARPA. So now they're under the umbrella of HERF funding. And so because we have received some funding, we've been able to recoup some of the lost revenue that were incurred during the pandemic. As a result of the pandemic, we lost tuition, we lost fees, we obviously lost other kind of things like vehicle registration fees, we lost commissions for our auxiliary fund. So a variety of revenue that we lost, we were able to recoup, and we were able to add that to our budget. And when I say add that to our budget, only as a contingency fund. In other words, only to fund something that is one-time funding, not to fund recurring expenses such as your salary. Salary enhancement should not, and will not here be funded, at least this is not our recommendation, is that you fund salary enhancement cost with HERF funds, unless it is like a one-time incentive plan like we've done this current fiscal year. We continue to have an impact. I mean, that as long as we have GASBs 68 and 75, we will continue having that impact. And that certainly has an impact on our fund balance, which is also called the unrestricted net position. If you recall, Mr. Peña, when he presented to the board on the audit last January, he discussed that. And for this past fiscal year, it was a $6 million impact. That was absorbed we had a lot of budget surpluses, and we were able to absorb that. But it doesn't mean we'll always have budget surpluses to absorb a $6 million hit. So revenue sources for our current fiscal year, still pretty much the same distribution. Property taxes take first place at 43.67% of that total pie, or a little bit over $65 million, followed by tuition and fees of $37.5 million, or a little bit over 25% of that total pie. And then in third place, state appropriations at 21%, or $31.6 million. This is second year of our biennium. Therefore, we do not get additional state funding, so they will stay pretty much, we will stay at that same amount. What is different here from previous years when we did not have federal funding is you see that allocation of the $9.7 million is when you adopted the budget. That was that we included that revenue recovery under the HERF. And $9.7 million was actually budgeted to be recovered this fiscal year. Now, because we did have an enrollment decrease in the fall and in the spring, we will be able to recover a little bit more than $9.7 million. But for the purpose of what I'm going to present in a while, we're just keeping it flat at $9.7 million. Because again, that cannot be used for future years, for any future funding. And then all these other three sources of revenue are pretty stable. Self-supporting program remained at $3 million. Overhead recovery at a little bit over $536,000, and then other income, which includes interest income, at $1.9 million. The next slide really represent statistics. You've seen these slides before, but I think it is important just to point out a couple of things under your major revenue sources and enrollment history. You can see the last 19 years, enrollment has gone up, gone down, gone up, and so right now we're about at the same level as we were in 2003. With a higher budget, because obviously costs have increased over the years because of salary enhancement packages and various initiatives that we had to implement. But what you see here, though, is the shift in state funding, right? So in 2003, state funding was actually the first revenue source. Well, now it's the third revenue source. What's represented in teal on this chart represents state appropriation, and it's in the third position now in terms of our major revenue sources. Then, of course, you see how property tax really takes the lead here. Just wanted to show you this chart about the resident tuition rate history. And you can see since 2016, we have implemented the model that was approved by the board to create a predictive, a little bit more predictable rate for our students and hopefully encourage them to graduate within 2 years, if it's not possible, but at least they have that option. And as you can see, we are now at, for 21-22, at $1,632 for 12 credit hours, including your general use fee as of fall 2021. This chart here represents our local property tax history and how much we have grown over the years, especially in the last 19 years. What's really interesting to see here is your tax rate. So in 2003, we had a tax rate that is higher than what it is today. And if you look at the growth of the valuation, it certainly has provided a lot of opportunities for El Paso Community College. What's also interesting to see about this chart is really how very few tax increases we have implemented in the last 19 years. So in 2003, for like 3 years, we did like 3%. Then we did not do any tax increases until about 2012 when we were cut by the state quite substantially. And then for a while, we did not do another tax increase. We did an 8% in 2014 because we had to respond to some requirement for new faculty, for additional faculty under the SAC-COC accreditation visit. And then, as you can see, we really limited our tax increases as much as possible to fund our budget. As we stand today, we have not had a tax increase in the last 3 years, and the last tax increase was 4%. But you also look, our cap is 15 cents, and our current tax rate right now is at 13.4760, 13 cents, 13.476 per $100 valuation. We anticipate that this probably will go down because our tax valuation is probably going to continue going up. We had a recent visit with the CAD, and they actually gave us some pretty good news that they do anticipate to do a reappraisal for the next 3 years in light of the market. That's something that they really look at. The last increase we had in valuation last year, this year versus last year, was an increase of about $2.8 billion. So pretty significant that really allows us to put a little bit more space between our authorized rate and our actual tax rate that the board adopts. This is a chart here that shows the enrollment and the unemployment rate history. Traditionally, as you know, anytime that the unemployment rate goes up, then the enrollment goes up. Well, due to the pandemic, that trend did not hold true. But just to kind of show you, obviously, the impact of unemployment and on enrollment. So when it comes down to the expenditure budget, this is what you adopted last August. And this is going to be the basis for our baseline budget going forward for next year. And I just want to bring out here a couple of things because some people might wonder, well, why is it instruction at $48.8 million is at 32% of the total budget, but institutional support now is higher at 33.64% of the budget. Well, the reason why is because in that institutional support, we have that set aside of $9.7 million due to the HERF lost revenue recovery. This is very temporary. Traditionally, instruction combined with academic support is truly, mix up like 50% of our total budget. So really, if you take away the close to $10 million that is sitting in institutional support, that is really a contingency that is only used if absolutely needed, your instruction combined with academic support still make up 50% of that total budget. And by the way, this is by function. This is the budget that you approve. But the budget that is most useful for everybody to see is actually the expenditure, the budget by expense category. So where all this money going? salaries versus supplies versus benefits. So here you can see that our faculty salaries makes up about 33% of that total budget at $49.8 million. It is composed of salaries for full-time faculty at $25.6 million, and part-time faculty a little bit over $24 million. So pretty good proportion here, almost one-to-one, full-time to part-time. This is also important to note that this also includes any vacant positions. So any positions that were vacated during the year, is going to reduce that budget. In other words, it's going to create some budget surplus and some room to fund other things when we actually compile the baseline budget. And it's the same thing for staff salaries. Full-time staff of $34.5 million, part-time staff of $7.2 million, that makes up about 28% of that total budget. So total combined, your full-time salaries, your staff salaries, and your related benefits, we're talking about 71% of our total budget. The other thing to note in here is the contingency. So that $10.4 million here includes that $9.7 million I talked about earlier, and that is the allocation, the set aside for one-time expense if we have any during the year, and that is derived because of that lost revenue recovery from the federal government.
Ms. Shaughnessy, very quick, I had a question. So
Sure.
if the contingency includes that $9 million from the HERF funding, where does the other portion come from? Right.
It's a small amount, so it's about, I want to say, maybe 600,000, Laura, close to that. That is a true contingency fund, little surplus. We try to not have our budget so tight that we're not able to fund some needs that come up during the year. And that contingency fund is used to fund permanent needs, not one-time kind of thing.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
That does answer my question. And I guess for the HERF funding, when does that have to be expended? And so we will see that decrease.
So the HERF funding can be spent on one-time kind of thing. So let's say, for example, we need to fund, and by the way, it does not have to be COVID-related. It's only what goes to the grant that has to be COVID-related. But the revenue recovery that we get from the federal government, when we draw that down, we can spend it on anything we need. So it could be incentive plan. It could be additional equipment that is needed during the fiscal year. It could be some initiatives that we're not able to fund through the regular budget. One time, though, we have to be very cautious not to fund recurring cost with that $9 million, because then that gets you out of your sustainability.
So then I guess for our purposes as well as we move forward with the budget meetings, will we get an idea in terms of what the plan is then to use those funds? Yeah, because I know sometimes we'll see it in the form of a specific agenda item that relates to a contract or to a service or an initiative, right? But I was hoping perhaps we could get just like an overall plan of, or idea of what we look to expend using those HERF funds for specific services programs.
Absolutely. And if we don't spend it, it goes into fund balance at the end of the fiscal year.
Okay,
So it does go towards a good cause.
okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Sanchez, we can also provide a report of what we've utilized those resources for to date. To date, we've spent approximately $78 million of the $122 million that was allocated to the college through the 3 tranches of HERF funding. Approximately $49 million has gone directly to students.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Actually, I have a slide on that, but that's the grant. That does not include, the $9.7 million is totally separate.
Okay.
So if you'd like to see that, we certainly can show you how we spent the grant, the $78 million that Dr. Sarata is talking about. The 9.7 is something that is strictly in our operating budget, that is there as a contingency if we want to spend it on anything, that the current budget cannot absorb. And like I said, it could be an incentive plan that we can put into motion. Any other questions on the contingency fund? I mean, this is very large. We rarely see a contingency fund of $10 million. Usually it's about $500,000, $600,000. And again, that helps us during the fiscal year fund. Those, it could be a position that we had to create because it was truly needed, dealing with safety or something that is a requirement from a grant to have a match. And so we would use that money for that reason. The other item that you see on this chart is transfers, and I'll talk about transfers in a little while. And about 3 of the total transfers are actually related to enrollment. And so there is some room, there's some wiggle room here that we can use when it comes down to maybe funding a deficit that is derived from, that is something that we need to do. The travel here is still not at the level that we had prior to the pandemic. If you recall, we had about $1.2 million budget for travel. And when we say travel, we're talking here about, networking, training, that kind of thing, staff retreats. We're talking about faculty retreat. So we were able last year, thanks to your approval of the budget, we were able to restore about $500,000 of what previously was cut. We cut $1 million in the previous fiscal year, so we did restore about half of it. Benefits is always a very large part of our budget, and those are budgeted actually, it's very adequate at this time. Of course, we don't know what the next legislative session is going to do to us. They could, if we have a decrease in enrollment, they could decide to actually cut our benefits based on that enrollment decline. But here we are very adequately funded, and we do not anticipate any increases in those budgets for next fiscal year. At least that's the news that I heard. But we'll see how we go through the budget process between now and July and see what it pans out. Projected transfers, as I mentioned earlier. So transfers here, what is really dependent on enrollment is about 3 main sources here. So you see your TPEG. This is directly related to enrollment. So it's based on 6% of tuition, of resident tuition. There's also an allocation for non-resident tuition, but the majority comes from resident tuition, and that's $1.9 million. If we have an enrollment decline, then we adjust that budget accordingly. Student Activities Fund, any transfers also based on enrollment. There's an allocation that goes to the Student Activities Fund, and the same thing with the Intercollegiate Athletic Fund of $1.8 million. So if it's pretty substantial, we will probably bring those down so that, because it makes sense, because those are really variable costs. And any time that you have a loss in revenue and you have a related variable cost, and you should adjust those accordingly. Still, we want to be reasonable. We don't want to be so tight that we don't have any room. But at the same time, it's going to make sense. We can't just ask you for a tuition increase or tax increase without looking at our budget and see where we can actually reduce our budget to kind of make ends meet, if that's even the proper term to state. These budget that you saw previously, the $149,804,039, can also be stated in a different way, which is budget by executive level. And this is really what we work with to generate the baseline budget. And when we do another budget workshop, what you've seen in the past is a comparison of what the adopted budget is and now what the preliminary baseline budget. Here, because we are not there yet, we're still compiling the budget requests, it's still an adopted budget. It's not a baseline budget yet. So this is just the allocation by executive level. This is what I was talking about earlier here. During the budget development process, executive levels, each executive level works with their teams, and they look at their budget, and they decide what is it they need to reallocate or not reallocate. It could be that they just keep exactly the same budget. However, what is going to change here, next time that we have a budget workshop, this is going to be, this amount of $149 million is going to be lower. And the reason why is because of vacant position positions that have become vacant due to retirement or employee turnover that occurred during the fiscal year. You're looking here at a budget that was approved in August. So, of course, since August, we have people that have retired, people that have decided to leave the college for whatever reason. And so that salary, that incumbent salary now has been brought down to the entry level of that range. And so that's going to generate some savings. You still can keep the position, but now that position is going to be recruited at a lower salary than it was for the incumbent. So that generates budget surplus. So that gives us some room to fund maybe additional requests or maybe to help us fund the budget deficit when we talk about that in just a minute. So let's talk about revenue projection for fiscal year 21-22. So for this fiscal year, as of February 2022, that includes the HERF, the revenue recovery. State appropriation are staying the same. Right now, for the purpose of this presentation, because we're still working on the numbers, the revenue recovery is budgeted to come in exactly the same amount at $9.7 million. It probably will be higher, as I mentioned earlier, but it's going for one-time kind of purchase. It does not really go towards a sustainable budget. So right now, just for the purpose of this presentation and to be conservative, because we cannot really use it for any salary increases or essential needs that are recurring year after year, we just leave it as it is. Tuition and fees, because of the enrollment decline in fall 2021 and spring 2022, we did have a decrease in tuition and fees revenue to the tune about close to $1.3 million. It is actually not as high as we had projected, and the reason why is because we also had a decrease in dual credit students. And so remember that our dual credit students and our early college high school students do not pay tuition, so we have to budget for exemptions because they are exempted from tuition. And so if we have a decrease in dual credit students, credit hours, then the exemptions obviously are not as high. So therefore, the $1.3 million reflect that kind of change. So it's not too hard. It's still $1.3 million, but it's certainly not as consequent as it could have been. Property taxes right now are projected to come in at the same amount. I would suspect actually it's going to be a little higher. This is just very conservative. Other income is projected to come in a little bit lower, and mostly due to probably testing fees and other things. Interest income has been a little bit challenging. As you know, the rates have been pretty low. We're talking here about less than 10, 11 basis points, something like that. If you look at your treasurer's report, you'll see what the interest rate is so far. But the good news is that the Federal Reserve has raised rates. Now the range is between 25 to 50 basis points, and they've already signaled that that trend is going to continue because they're trying to really control the inflation. So we do anticipate for next year that our interest income is going to be a little higher. I'm always a little leery about counting on interest income to fund or to balance the budget, and the reason why is because you never know what can happen during the year that will affect those interest rates. Nobody anticipated a pandemic, and our interest income was really very nice, and then all of a sudden the pandemic hit, and we had to reduce that budget significantly, like $1.9 million. So I tend to be a little bit more cautious about budgeting or projecting interest income. So when we look at the total revenue that we anticipate by the end of this fiscal year is going to be down about $1.4 million. But we have quite a bit of room in our budget to absorb that. So that is really not of concern at this time for this fiscal year. The next slide is really to kind of give you a picture of the composition of our credit enrollment in terms of, here this is the count, the enrollment count of students, and it's in total for each one of those years. But if you look at fall of 21, 22, we did, actually starting with 1920, and in 2021, you can see that we had a decrease in student enrollment. So the blue bar is to show the total enrollment. The yellow bar is to show that of that total enrollment, we had 9,434 students total in early college high school, and then in dual credit, a little bit over 11,000 students. That's the dark blue bar. And then if you look now at the fall and the spring, we don't have the summer in there, but as you can see, there is a decrease in total enrollment. And there's also a decrease, there was quite a bit of a decrease in dual credit students I had mentioned earlier. And of course, that translates into credit hours. And those credit hours, as you can see here, again, follow the same pattern. And the credit hours, that's what generates the tuition. Here, we did not put any contact hours because really that's what generates the state funding. But we certainly can do that in future slides, especially for next year when we are looking at state funding. But again, this is just to show you the makeup of our paying student mix when it comes down to enrollment. 64%, a little bit over 64% of our our paying mix is from paying students, and then about 35% is shared between the dual credit and the early college. When it comes down to credit hours, you can also see that trend. Certainly, you can see how in 2021, we certainly had a decrease in paying students, and we did have an increase in dual credit and early college, but that actually reversed in the fall of 21 and the spring of 22. You can see that for dual credit, actually it was now 10% for dual credit students. So we did have a decrease as compared to 12% the previous fiscal year. And early college high school went up because we opened up some new early college sites. So that makes sense. So what are we looking at revenue projections for next year? Because this is really what we are here to just give you some preliminary numbers. And again, it's preliminary because we're still in summer enrollment mode. Fall enrollment has not started yet. It's going to start on April the 1st. So we really don't have a very good gauge right now to give you more accurate numbers, but this is what we are projecting, and we are projecting based on what's happened this year, because that's really the only gauge that we have. We certainly at this point don't want to give you a false, a false view of what's going to happen next year. So obviously this is going to change by the time that you all approve the budget in August, and certainly June and July will be much better predictors of what our projections will be like for next year. So again, those are pretty much the same numbers. I backed out here the revenue recovery. We do anticipate that we will have a revenue recovery. We are getting an automatic no-cost extension to carry forward the unexpended fund from HERF into next fiscal year. And that would expire, I'm trying to remember for next year. When would that expire? May for next year? May 11th. So we can project some revenue recovery from next year, but for the purpose of showing you a sustainable budget, I backed it out. So we don't have to worry about that at this point, because it's not going to fund any recurring expenses. So when we look at next year, backing out the revenue recovery from HERF, we would be starting at $139,611,398 in terms of total revenue sources to support a budget that cannot be higher than $139 million, right? Assuming that we don't have any other costs. So for the purpose of, well, let me go back here. So this, normally, when I present this slide, this time of the year is to come before you and say, look, we need to consider a tuition increase because we are at the beginning of a new cycle. So that would be the normal process to come before you every even year to say, effective fall of that year, we should consider a tuition increase because that's part of the model that was approved back in 2016. So usually we look at our revenue, we say, okay, how much are we going, what is it that, is this a good gauge to decide on the tuition rate increase or not? Here, what you can also see is in this model, our property taxes are projected at $1 million higher, and this is only to account for any new property, not because you are approving or because we are recommending a tax increase at this point. So the $1 million is truly to account for additional revenue because of new property that was added on the tax roll. And every year, it's pretty predictable. It's about $1 million, $1.2 million, something like that. I'm just being conservative here at $1 million. We anticipate every year pretty much the model has proven to be pretty accurate. The $1 million is actually a pretty good gauge. The other income here has not been touched to be conservative, but we anticipate to change that. We think that by the time that we're ready to come before you for another budget workshop, whether it is in June or July, or maybe earlier if you need it, but we anticipate that this other income is significantly going to change because of the interest income that we're going to anticipate to be higher. And we probably can come up with something that is reasonable but not too optimistic. We want to be very cautious, again, how we project interest income because it can be so volatile. So the reason why you see this now is to talk, normally we would be talking about a 2-year tuition rate schedule. So we are at that point where that is time to look at our current cycle. The current cycle was effective the fall of 2020, which was right in the middle of the pandemic, through this summer. There was a caveat when you approved this model is that we would have a growth in formula and benefits funding. We've never had to exercise that caveat. Even though the state has reduced our state funding, like, this year it was over the buy-in and was $1.2 million. We never had to say in mid-cycle, go to the student and say, we need to fund our budget or the deficit, and we need to have a tuition increase. We have not done that. What's a little bit different this year, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute.
Sorry, quick
Yes.
question, just so that I understand, because you
Sure.
put in here caveat, growth in formula and benefits funding. Can you break that down to me to tell me what that means? I'm sorry, I don't understand.
So that means that when the board adopted this cycle, it basically guaranteed, cautiously guaranteed the student that there would not be a tuition increase in the middle of a cycle. However, there was a caveat. If we get substantially decrease in state funding or benefits, we may not have a choice. So that's what that caveat is about.
Okay, so it's contingent then on state appropriation.
Exactly. Better said, contingent upon state appropriation, absolutely.
And the reason for that, Ms. Sanchez, was because we wanted students to know what they were expected to pay year after year without throwing a wrench in their financial plans, if possible.
Exactly, and exactly, by setting a tuition rate for a 2-year cycle, we felt like the board actually felt that it could encourage students to graduate within this cycle. It certainly is a good incentive. We know it's not always possible for every student to do that, but certainly it did provide that kind of predictability on the tuition rate.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So one of the things that we do, we have to determine the amount increase per credit hour for both resident and non-resident to supplement sources of revenue to fund the operating budget. So that was really the push behind this model. And we've done actually a preliminary presentation to the Tuition and Fees Committee on March the 2nd. We weren't quite sure how we were going to approach this for various reasons that I'm going to talk about, because when you see what the tuition rate increase scenarios create for the student, as compared to really the amount of revenue that it generates based on our current enrollment, we felt like that's something that we needed to discuss. But we did present to the Tuition and Fees Committee And we, at the following meeting, we actually said we were going to hold off until we had the presentation to the board, and we were going to hold off until we felt a little bit more comfortable with the enrollment for this year. So they are basically on standby kind of thing, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. The current, what you have before you here is the current tuition and fee structure. Our resident rate is $116 per credit hour, or $136 with the general use fee. The non-resident rate is $201 per credit hour, or $221 with general use fee, and our general use fee is $20 per credit hour. We do not have an out-of-district tuition rate. Just for information, in 2021, if that would have affected 173 students in the entire district, close to 2,000, a little bit over 2,000 credit hours. So it's not really something that would bring some significant revenue by the board approving an out-of-district rate. We're talking here about counties, and I mean cities like community colleges like Austin and Collin, and they have some, different districts where they actually charge an out-of-district rate that is higher than their in-district rate.
Do we have a number or a breakdown in terms of where those 173 students come from?
I'm sorry?
A breakdown of of where those 173 students come from?
I can find out.
Okay, all right, that's fine.
Sure,
Thank
I
you.
certainly can find out, yeah. Other fees that are usually assessed that are applicable and subject to the increase because they are charged either by course or per credit hours, your distance ed fee at $55 per course. Right now, we are waiving that in light of the pandemic, and a three-peat fee for students that are repeating a course. So that is, this is not meant to be a moneymaker whatsoever. We want to encourage our students not to repeat a course. So actually, really, the revenue, this has really worked pretty well because the revenue generated from that particular source of revenue actually has gone down. That means that our students are really not interested in paying that extra money, so they're really working harder not to have to repeat a course. The tuition rate is earmarked to the operating budget, but the general use fee is earmarked to repay the bond debt. So the general use fee does not benefit the operating budget. I want to be very clear on that. And that generates about a little bit under $10 million a year. So looking at our tuition rate increase scenarios, just wanted to show you the impact, because at this time, we're not recommending a tuition rate increase for the fall for sure, because we don't want to do that at this time. But if we were to implement a tuition increase for the fall, we're talking here about, and you can see there are like 6 scenarios of tuition increases. And what I have highlighted in yellow is the revenue that is being generated for each one of those scenarios. But you can also see the rates for if we increase, let's say, by $1. Right now, we're at $16.32. So under $1 for the resident tuition, that would go up to $1,644. For the increase of $3, that would, let's see if I can, there you go. So if we were to implement a tuition increase of $1 per credit hour, that would cost the student $1,644 versus $1,632. For increase of $3, $1,668. So you can see how much the rate is for our students, but you also can see how much money it is generating in terms of revenue. So if we were to implement that for the entire fiscal year, in other words, effective in the fall, for $1, it generates $305,000. Now, 2 years ago, that same increase would have been about double, okay? So the enrollment decline has really created some challenges when you are looking at cost benefit of doing a tuition increase, when you have really a downward enrollment. If I were to, let me show you the next slide. So this is here a tuition and fees tax levy comparison among the the various community colleges, some of the big ones, and also some of the border community colleges. So right now, El Paso is the third highest in the state. Third highest in the state. If we were to implement $1, we would be now $1 would still put us in third place. We don't know what these community colleges are going to do, by the way, during the fiscal year. During a survey that was administered to the various community colleges, about 50% of the community colleges were not going to increase tuition, and 30% were still undecided. So, but just to give you some perspective on the impact on the student, but generating not a lot of revenue. Now, certainly we could do a combination of a tuition increase, let's say starting in the spring and the summer, and it does generate, of course, a little bit of money. And it also still keeps you within the same tuition increase cycle, okay? If we wait later, then we are off cycle. And we try to really implement that model during an off year when we don't get any additional state funding. So again, this is just to show you what the various scenarios here generate in terms of tuition revenue. You really have to go into like $6 or $8 to really generate some significant income to help us with the budget strategies that I'm going to show in a little while. So again, this is just for your information. We're going to be evaluating the current, the current environment, the enrollment, and then we may go back to, we may make a recommendation for, let's say, an increase starting in the spring. At this point, it is too late to do for the fall anyway, because we are opening the fall registration on April the 1st, and we cannot have a tuition increase after we have opened up enrollment, for that semester anyway. So I don't know if you have any question on this particular slide. That just kind of shows you again the impact on the student based on the various scenarios, but again, you would have to go through some significant increases in order to generate some significant revenue under the current conditions. Now, of course, enrollment goes up, that will generate a whole lot more revenue. But right now, this is what we're looking at, and we are conservative. So in terms of, we have included a slide here that compares our current tuition with the various educational institutions in the area. And we also have included some private institution for your information.
Can we put it in the paper?
I'm sorry?
Can we put it in the newspaper?
Dr. Serrata, can we put it in the newspaper? I'm the finance person. So that's our PR person. But certainly it does speak highly about the college, still being the best value in the region. So El Paso Community College right now, as I mentioned, your resident tuition is at $1,632. For those same 12 credit hours, Doña Ana charges, because our students are considered to be non-resident for Doña Ana, and so that's $2,832. And in New Mexico State University, they do consider our students to be resident, therefore we compare it with their rate at $3,650. UT El Paso, you can see the rates there. It's still at $4,055 for the College of Business Administration, and it's a little bit more affordable. Well, I guess those are different programs anyway. For all the other colleges, it ranges from $3,653 all the way to a little bit over $4,000. And then you compare to the private institution, and that's based on the highest program cost, by the way. This is the information that we receive. So as you can see, El Paso Community College still provide the best value for the first 2 years of college. Now, the financial aid options, just kind of, we put that slide up there just to kind of let you know that, those are the opportunities for our students to apply for financial aid. And our federal Pell Grant right now is at $6,495 for the total year. And of course, you can see all the rates for per semester versus for either full-time versus three-quarter of a time and half-time. Of course, we have the various other type of financial aid, your SEOG, your work study, the variety, state financial aid. We have the TPEG, of course, TOG. We have the tuition installment plan, and we have institutional aid, that is the institutional scholarship with the various deadlines. What's not up here is, of course, the HER funding. So the HER funding is as for the students anyway, that has been fairly fully expended, at least the portion that it was designated for the student, but we certainly can look at an additional allocation for them for next year with that no-cost extension.
The institutional scholarships, what is that about and how much?
I don't know, there's something maybe Dr. Maya can respond.
Can you repeat that, please, Dr. Graham?
You weren't paying attention.
I didn't hear you either.
The institutional aid or institutional scholarships, to me, that sounds like it's an investment in our own staff or, to try and help people get an education or continue their education, rather. But do you know what that entails?
I believe these institutional scholarships are the ones that are upcoming that are run out of the college's foundation. Like we have there's a couple of them coming up right now. So those aren't through financial aid.
But if they're through the foundation, why would they be on this budget?
I believe, Dr. Maya, we do have some institutional scholarship, like, for example, your vendors like Barnes & Noble that provide a scholarship that we do administer, other kind of scholarship, I believe.
So I guess my question is more for employees that are trying to upgrade their own education or continue it. Where is that budget coming from? Where is that money allocated? That's why I was thinking that institutional aid is. For example, are we helping the ones that are out there trying to get a doctorate degree? Are we helping the ones that are employees that are trying to get a master's degree? Are we helping the ones that are, like our office personnel and people that are trying to get an associate's degree? We're in the business of education, so we should be supporting those initiatives, and I'm sure we are somewhere.
Yes, ma'am.
I just don't know where that budget.
So, Dr. Graham, actually, those kind of scholarship cannot be funded by the operating budget. So they are funded in the auxiliary fund. We have a budget about $300,000, but that's for the students that are seeking an associate's degree. We have the staff scholarship for those employees who are going through the college, and we have a staff scholarship program. We also have an educational assistance program, also funded by the auxiliary fund. For any kind of program, we are working right now on the professional development leave program that allows employees to, we're revising the procedure. It's taking a little bit longer than we wanted, but it is being reviewed at this point. That actually grants time off for employees to study. We don't grant them actual money, but we do grant them time off for them to study, let's say for a semester or for a full year. If it's for a full year, they are paid half the salary. So it's a little different for faculty and staff, but we do, under the professional development leave, we are providing that opportunity, and that's currently under review. And we do have a budget, very small budget right now that we'll be working on to actually increase.
Can we at some point, Dr. Serrata, have a report on that when it comes closer to the revisions that they're trying to make so that we can see how much money we're going to spend on helping educate our own staff?
Yes, ma'am, absolutely.
Thank you.
So to move forward on how we're going to, I already talked about this, the reason why I put it back over here. You probably don't have this in your presentation, but it's the same slide as I previously presented, but to kind of, as a segue to our strategies, I wanted to just refresh your memory that we're going to be starting with revenue projection at $139.6 million for next year. Again, very preliminary, as I mentioned, because we don't know yet how summer is going to pan out and how fall is going to pan out. So those numbers are going to change. I can promise you that you will not see the same amount by next time that we present to you. The property taxes is going to change because right now we're in the process again of the evaluation. We just met with the CAD. And so by the time we meet in July, we'll have a certified valuation, we'll have a new tax rate, a no new revenue tax rate, and then we'll have a discussion about how we're going to generate more property tax revenue to fund our budget. Other income is going to change, as I mentioned. So again, the 139.6, very preliminary. But it is still pretty conservative because I backed out the HERF, the revenue recovery, okay? Because we really don't want to depend on that to fund, let's say, salary enhancement, okay? So when comparing what those revenue projections are for next year, we're comparing that, and if we were to, and again, these are just scenarios. They are not saying, please consider 1% salary increase, or 2%, 3%, 4%, or 5%. This is truly just scenarios just to show you what the bottom line is going to be, or could not be, depending on what we decide to do. Now, if you compare that with a rollover budget, now the rollover budget, remember we adopted a budget a little bit over 149 million. So to compare apples to apples, I backed out the $9.7 million, okay? To really say sustainable budget, let's assume we do not have any HERF funding for next year. Does that make sense to you? I know it's a little complicated, but I was trying to make it as simple as possible because I don't want to mix all these sources of funding, okay? So when we look, I could have just left the HERF on both, but I chose to back it out, so it's just not taken into consideration. So no matter how you look at it, for no salary increase, at this point, we have a preliminary budget deficit, $433,874, okay? Can this be found in the budget? Yes, it can. It can. Let me tell you why. Remember, I mentioned earlier that we have variable cost. Variable costs are obviously very dependent upon our enrollment. So enrollment goes up, your variable costs are going to go up. Your enrollment goes down, your variable costs are going to go down. So we do have some room in the budget between our part-time staff salaries budget and our part-time faculty salaries budget. It doesn't mean that we are cutting those budgets. All we are saying is that if we are not needing that staff or the faculty, then we can go ahead and feel comfortable about maybe funding the $433,000. Okay? We can also probably reduce the budget, the transfers to the various funds that I discussed earlier that are very much dependent upon enrollment. So can we find $433,000? Yes, we can. But again, here you have pretty much, you're not considering additional requests. We don't know what those are going to be until probably the May, June timeframe. You're not considering salary enhancement. And salary enhancement, we know, is become more of a challenge for us because we know the inflation is, I think, as of last month, 7.5%.
7.9.
I'm sorry?
7.9.
Stand corrected, 7.9. Okay. But, compared to like inflation of 2% in the past, or 2.5%, it's tremendous.
I would just like to make a comment because I know that I want to say semester, but it was last budget season, we had provided the salary enhancements and we did it for the part-time employees of the college as well as the full-time employees of the college. And I'd really think maybe perhaps this board with budget's assistance should consider as we move forward in budget hearings to really take a hard look at what we're paying our lowest salaried employees. I don't know, Ms. Shaughnessy, do you have a number of what that hourly rate is?
I don't know about the hourly rate per se, but I would say it is above minimum. But let's say, for example, you may have some salaries that start at, let's say, $24,000, $25,000 a year.
Yeah, I think we need to take a hard look at that,
Yes.
especially if we haven't visited that in quite some time. I think it's only fair And across the board, in terms of other, if you're looking at other private companies, you know, you're talking about either fast food restaurants, retails, places, you're also looking at other governmental entities in terms of the hourly rate. I just think as a board, we really should take a hard look at that and have a revisiting of that. It's only fair to do so for those employees.
So and Ms. Sanchez, that's something that Dr. Serrata and I think the cabinet have been discussing, because we're having a harder time recruiting staff, because certainly it's not necessarily even the lowest paid. It's basically, you know, across the board on many positions. So we are going to be recommending a salary study. There's no doubt. We need to do that. The last time we did a salary study was in 2000 with the Evergreen study. So that was implemented in 2016, but the salary study was actually done in 2014. So we're talking here about now, you know, 8 years old. And they have recommended in the past probably to do that every 5 years. But it is costly, and we need to be ready for that. We need to be ready. If we're going to do a salary study, and we have to be willing to certainly put the dollars to it, and it's going to cost us some money, definitely. There are some positions that are harder to recruit than others, definitely. So we have to also look at that. But yes, salary study, Ms. Sanchez, you're right on target. That has been on our mind now for the last couple of years. And of course, this pandemic has certainly created kind of putting that on the back burner. But also, it's creating a lot of opportunities for people out there, and now we're having a harder time to recruit because the salaries are getting to be higher on the outside. So we do need to look at that, and we already started looking at that.
Thank you.
So thank you.
But at the same time, we also need to do a study on the student recruitment, because what's the point of continuing to raise salaries or look at salary increases if we're not increasing the number of students coming in? My position has always been that everyone in the college is a recruiter. How many students have you recruited? How many have you brought in? You know, if you have an individual that's bringing in a lot of students, I think they should, you know, be entitled to some kind of enhancement or bonus, or I know we can't give away public funds, but some way of rewarding them for that effort. Because I know that there's a lot of people out there that are aggressively recruiting our kids and our students, you know, the young ones and the older ones. So yes, I don't have a problem with us doing another study, and it's a headache, and the board takes a beating with those studies because everybody thinks that because we're going to do a study, everybody's going to get an increase. And the salary study, sure, you know, I hope that we learned a lot from the last one that we did, and we have, you know, kind of stuck to those.
Well, we did
areas.
both last time. We did classification and salary, so that was quite complicated.
And job descriptions to see if people are really doing what their job description calls for.
And there's definitely a need, and that's something that's been discussed with Dr. Pena, to really look at our job descriptions again, because, yeah, things have changed, definitely, and especially in this environment, things have changed again.
Yeah, I bet you the majority of us didn't have virtual instruction on our job descriptions, and all of a sudden you're here. This is how you're going to teach now.
We have a lot of work to do, Dr. Graham.
We do,
We do.
but we're getting it done.
But I think, just to add to that, I think that's an important point, because when you brought that up, Dr. Graham, it's almost like, wait, no, there's two separate issues, but there really are not. I don't think they're mutually exclusive, because I do think that we are seeing an issue in terms of the student enrollment, but that does coincide in terms of the assistance and the help that we need, I think, on the other end, to ensure that we know we have quality faculty and staff for our college, but how then do we take it to that next level to ensure that we're recruiting those students who deserve to be taught by very well-qualified individuals? And quite frankly, you just look at the tuition rates for other technical colleges, and blown away by how much is being charged to these students versus what the great value that the community college brings. But I think that's a great point, and it's not necessarily mutually exclusive. We really should look at them hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you.
This table is very helpful, giving us the different salary increases, not necessarily that you're recommending one or the other, but, it gives.
Just for you to have a perspective of the bottom line, when employees say, I want a 5%, what can I have a 5%? Well, 5% salary increase, that's cost $4.5 million.
But it could work if Dr. Amaya says we had a 99%
Yes.
increase in student enrollment.
Definitely. And it is a challenge right now because, again, we talked about tuition rate increase, see what really revenue it's going to bring versus really what we actually need. It is very challenging. Like I said, every year is a little different here. If we're looking at this year we did a 2%. You all approved a 2%. We did have an incentive that was distributed in December. And we certainly can look at that again going forward to kind of help, mitigate some of that. And between now and July, we're going to be working really hard to do that. So if you look at the bottom line here, if we, let's say we don't do a tuition increase this for next year, then the other option that you have is, no salary increase. And we're going to have to work really hard to fund those critical needs that are going to come that we don't know about yet because we're still working through the additional request. We could also look at them as, there are various strategies that we can adopt. We can look at them as being one time for 1 year and then having to worry about funding them the following year. We try not to work that way. We don't want to do little Band-Aids here and there. We're trying to be a little bit more sustainable than that. And by the way, this is really something that when the federal awards were distributed, this was something that was very much discouraged to use those federal awards for any recurring cost, and we want to abide by that as much as possible. Probably also pretty discouraged by SAC-COC, by the way. So when we look at a percentage of tax increase needed to cover that kind of deficit, what I have put there for you is various percentages, okay? So 1% is going to generate about $659,000. And if you go all the way 2%, $1.3 million, where at a salary increase of 1%, now you can cover that deficit with a 2% tax increase. At a 2% salary increase, you can cover that $2.2 million that is a deficit with a 3%, give and take. Can we find another $300,000? We probably can. So this is just to give you some ideas of what it would take to cover a deficit that is generated because we have a salary enhancement that cannot be covered by the current revenues that we are generating. Those revenues, again, are going to change. So a lot of things are going to change here, but here I'm giving you kind of the worst-case scenario. As far as I know, hopefully we're not going to go further down in enrollment than what I have stated. We're not going to get, hopefully, cut in state funding, and our tax revenue is very predictable. So this is kind of, just an idea for you to work with, and hopefully things obviously will change by the next time that we meet. The next slide here is just to show you a chart that you've seen before, what percentage tax based on the current valuation, that's going to change, based on the current tax rate, that's going to change, but at least you have an idea at 8%. At 8% tax increase, you are at 14.55 cents per $100 valuation, or an increase of 1 penny above what we have now. At 15 cents, that is your maximum, okay? But that would definitely trigger, if you wanted to go to 15 cents, that would definitely trigger a voter approval. Mm-hmm. But obviously, that's not something we're advocating. But it's just to kind of give you an idea here, the 8% is your voter approval rate. This is what used to be called the rollback rate. Rollback, thank you. See, I even forgot now because we are so used to the new terminology. But the effective tax rate now is called the known revenue tax rate. So we won't know that until July when we get the certified appraisal value. So that's just, again, to give you an idea of this chart here is very useful to see what each percentage the resulting tax rate, the increase in the cents, the tax levy, and the increase in revenue, and then the impact on the homeowner. Next step. Almost done with the presentation. Next step. So the next step is to compile our baseline budget, and that will be lower than the adopted budget. There's no doubt about that because of what I've told you before. Since you adopted the $149 million budget, we had some retirements, we've had some people leaving the college for other reasons, and so that's going to create a little bit of flexibility, a little bit of space there, if you will, to fund some either critical requests or some of that salary increase that we may be recommending. We're going to evaluate any budget surpluses we have in our budget because we can do a combination. We can try to be reasonable on the tax increase. We can try to be reasonable on the tuition increase effective in the spring if we want to go that route, and then limit the impact on the budget because obviously you want to have a little bit of breathing room in your budget. Enrollment goes up, we've got to have obviously the faculty to teach those additional sections. So again, it's kind of one of those gambling kind of thing that you have to use various strategies to bring forward to you a budget that is sustainable, that is not so tight that you don't have any flexibility. We're going to refine our revenues. As I mentioned earlier, summer and fall enrollment become more predictable. Obviously, for fall, it will not be until about July, the end of July, probably. We want to evaluate the impact of the tax rate increase combined with the tuition increase in spring of 2023, and then we need to review our budget request for critical needs. So we are sure that there are some things out there we need to consider. Obviously, anything that is safety related, that's a priority. Anything that is instructional related, accreditation, anything that really have to be covered, we don't have a choice but to fund it. So the planning for the adoption of the budget, we are looking at a preliminary property appraisal April the 30th. June, July, we are looking at budget workshops with the Board of Trustees. We'll have another updated property appraisal at the end of June. July the 25th is the magic number, the magic date here to get our certified appraisal, which, by the way, due to the significant amount of protest that they are anticipating, probably will be discounted about 2.8%. So just to kind of give a little bit of room there. So the appraisal may not be at the full value that they're recommending, but because the amount of protest that they get, it usually is discounted a little bit. The July board meeting, this is where we would come before you for a consideration of a salary enhancement. And August is the magic month where we ask you to approve the budget. August 31st is the magic date. That's by law. It has to be adopted. And then the tax rate. So depending on what the board decides to do, the tax rate will need to obviously be considered. If there is no tax rate increase approval, that is just stayed as what is the no new revenue tax rate. In other words, no impact whatsoever on the taxpayers, at least on our part, then we're looking at an August adoption. If it requires a little bit more work, such as obviously a public hearing, then we would probably be looking at September for you all to approve. You have to approve the tax rate by September 30th. So with that, I certainly thank you for your very kind attention, and anything else that I can answer? Apologize for the length of this presentation, but you did get a lot of information.
You always do. Well, thank you, Josette.
You're very welcome, sir.
Appreciate all the hard work.
Well, I have a very good team to help me, so, and I appreciate your kindness too.
I do have one question. If we go back to this study.
He's nervous now.
I mean, the salary study?
Yeah, because the last time, I think the biggest problem, it wasn't a problem for me, but there was a lot of people that work here at the college that were not happy with, there was a lot of people that were happy and a lot of people that weren't happy.
That we're not going to have one, I'm sorry?
There was a lot of people happy and a lot of people
yes.
unhappy.
That is unfortunately, that's what happens during those studies.
So explain to me that we had this study and they were supposed to fix it. Why do we always have to have another one? Why can't we make sure that everybody stays happy?
So I'll begin, Judge. So a couple of things. Right now, we're dealing with a significant amount of inflation across the sector, and I think that is making,
But that's, Doc, come on, that's been going on for forever.
no, inflation,
Inflation, and we have, yeah, when you're get as old as I am, I remember interest rates at 18%.
as do
Come
I.
on.
No, I agree, Judge, but what we're dealing with at this point is an inflation rate that is about 4 times the normal inflation rate of an annual cost of living expense, so to speak. It's usually at about 2.1. Last month, it was 7.9. So my recommendation is that we not go into a comprehensive salary study when inflation is at the rate that it is currently. Now, I do think that we can do some salary surveys and get a pulse of there's some specific areas that have become incredibly difficult to fill, some in Ms. Shaughnessy's area, some in Dr. Giron's area. Those are specific areas that I think that we need to look at and do a survey to see where we are. I don't think it's a wise idea to do a comprehensive salary study during high inflation when we're about 4 times the normal cost of living increases. We're at 7.9, normal is about 2.1. And the college, quite frankly, covers that when you look at cost of living. We traditionally recommend to the board approximately a 3%. This last year, we did a 2% just based on how tight the budget was, but that normally covers that. Now, when you ask, right now, given the reduction in employees, every age group that is 27 and older, there's almost 10 million fewer of them in the workforce. It's only our youth, actually, and that's where our students are, Dr. Graham. So our 18 to 26-year-olds, there's 5 million more of them in the workforce currently now than there was in the fall of 2019. And right now, when you go into the workforce, those minimum wage jobs are now paying $13, $15, even $17 an hour.
So what you're looking at, Doctor, we're gonna have to raise tuition 7-8%. Here's what, when it went to 18% back in the late 70s,
Yep.
what did the college do? Tuition-wise, tax-wise? I mean, do we ever go back and look at a history and see what we did to make sure that we're covering? I mean, we have no control over inflation. But for us to sit here and say, okay, we're gonna give all our employees enough money to cover inflation, it's gonna be almost impossible.
Yeah, and we're not recommending that, as you saw.
I
None
just
of the,
hope everybody sees the writing on the wall, because everything I read, this is gonna be going on for the next 6-7 years.
I haven't read those. Everything that I've read is talked about at least for the next 6 to 18 months, that we'll continue to see inflation at a raised rate. So Judge, if you ask if we go back in history, so I mean, I can speak to the 10 years that I've been with the institution as well as before that, and what was different is the state. The state provided significantly more resources to the institution.
But we blew that chance. We didn't do our homework with our lobbyists and stuff.
You were on the board.
Oh, I know, it's gonna be my fault.
No, so
I was the one yelling and screaming and saying, why aren't we getting more?
well, we're at a unique opportunity, Judge.
And
So
it's just gonna be very discouraging when these people, you gotta understand that inflation's going up, but there's no way we're gonna be able to cover a 7% increase.
Agreed. No, we certainly agree. Ms. Shaughnessy and her team and I, we certainly agree with that. That's what the scenarios we provided were anywhere from 1 to 5. I have a recommendation that will come forward as we get closer to the budget period. But what I would say, Judge, is we're in a unique position. The Community College Finance Commission at the state, that was created by Senate Bill 1250, if I'm not mistaken, is moving forward with their work. They are expected to have final recommendations in the October-November timeframe. Those will then go forward to the legislature. They'll go forward to the governor, lieutenant governor, and speaker of the House as we get into the 23 session. There is opportunity, if all 50 colleges can get on the same page, there is an opportunity for additional resources to come to community colleges.
Wait, and trust me, I know the state's gonna be in, because sales tax is gonna go up because everything's gonna cost more. And you know Texas has oil, so oil's at $150 a barrel. Texas is gonna have money. But everybody's gonna be down there yelling and screaming that inflation's 10% and we need more money. So I just wanna make sure that we get our piece of the pie.
We agree.
But I just hope that the employees, it's not us, but there's no way we're gonna be able to cover a 7% increase in, there's just no way. And what are we planning on, like, cutting down on cars and fuel and supplies? I mean, is there any committee set up here at the college to start looking at tightening our belt on some of this stuff?
We always look at, and that is something that Ms. Shaughnessy and her team, along with the rest of cabinet, will look at with regards to tightening the belt, so to speak. Absolutely.
I mean, we're just gonna have to, this does not look good at all. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Everybody stay happy.
Oh, yeah, now you want us to be happy.
I'm telling you.
No, I think that we have a very good team, especially in the financial side of the house, that they will come up with some good recommendations and, and that we can agree on to do the best that we can for all employees and at the same time, stay within our budgets.
Okay. We done for till the board meeting, or what's next?
Executive session.
Okay, ma'am, we're gonna go to executive session. We have to go talk about,
Would you like me to read item 5.2 first? Item 5.2, discussion and take possible action regarding the investment or use of the $30 million charitable grant to the college from the National Philanthropic Trust. The Board of Trustees may conduct an executive or closed session pursuant to Chapter 551 of the Texas Government Code for one or more of the following reasons: consultation with its attorney to seek or receive legal advice, or consultation regarding pending or contemplated litigation, or for any purpose authorized by law, discussion about the value or transfer of real property, discussion about a prospective gift or donation, consideration of specific personnel matters, discussion about security personnel or devices, or discussion of certain economic development matters. The board may also announce that it will go into an executive session on any item listed on this agenda if the subject matter is permitted for a closed session by provisions of Chapter 551 of the Texas Government Code. Any vote regarding these items shall be taken in open session. Discussion with legal counsel regarding a charitable grant to the college of $30 million from the National Philanthropic Trust pursuant to Section 551.073 of the Texas Government Code.
okay, the Board of Trustees is back in session out of executive session. I'm going to ask for a motion for adjournment so that we can get ready for our, is it 4:30?
4:30, yes, sir.
Our 4:30 meeting. Do I have a motion?
So move, sir.
Okay, all in favor? Aye. Aye. Any opposed? We are adjourned.